Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you give us and, well, we really dig in to pull out the core insights for you, the learner.
Exactly. We try to find those nuggets that can really shift your perspective.
And today we're focusing on the introduction to a book by Ariel Louis called King Truth, Glory, or The Vindication of the King.
It's inspired by his father, Rabbi David Louis, and the source itself calls it a revolutionary perspective on the book of Samuel. So should be interesting.
Definitely sounds like it. We've got excerpts from that introduction right here.
Right. And our mission, so to speak, is to unpack the main arguments Louis makes right at the start. We want to see these interpretations focus on the key stories he highlights and grasp the underlying messages he's getting at.
Okay, sounds good. Where do we start?
Well, Louis kicks things off with a very personal, very powerful memory involving his father, Rabbi David Louis.
Ah, yes, I remember reading that. It's about King David's lament for Absalom, isn't it?
It is. He paints this incredibly vivid picture, doesn't he? His father wrapped in his talith.
Yeah, and not just reading, but chanting. Really feeling David's grief for Absalom. He quotes it, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died for thee."
It's intense. You really get a sense of profound sorrow. And his father explained something quite extraordinary to him then.
What was that?
That David, in that moment of grief, was trying to pull Absalom's soul up from the 7 levels of the underworld.
7 levels, wow.
Yeah, trying to bring him all the way up to an 8th level towards the Garden of Eden. These levels, maybe think of them as like spiritual states.
Okay, that's a powerful image. But as a kid, Louis saw Absalom differently, right?
Totally. He admits, back then Absalom was just the bad guy, the scoundrel who betrayed his father, King David.
The hero, especially after Goliath. So, simple good versus evil.
Pretty much. But his father just completely flipped that. He presented Absalom's story not as some side plot, but as central, absolutely core to David's entire life.
Highlighting David's love for him.
Immense love, unconditional love even, willing to die in his place. It's quite something.
So why did this specific memory become so important for Ariel Louis later on? How did it shape his view of the Bible?
Well, I think it was the seed, the start of realizing that these texts have layers, so many layers, that the obvious meaning might not be the only one or even the deepest one.
Ah, okay. Which leads into another big idea he brings up early on.
Exactly. This concept of hidden wisdom, or what he calls inverse meanings.
Inverse meanings. What does that mean exactly?
It's the idea that the deepest wisdom in these stories often runs counter to, or is the inverse of, what seems apparent on the surface.
Okay, can you give an example?
He uses a really potent one, Abraham and Isaac, the binding of Isaac.
Right, a story that makes a lot of people uncomfortable.
Deeply uncomfortable. The initial reaction can be, seeing Abraham as almost barbaric and questioning a God who'd asked for that. It's disturbing.
Absolutely.
But Louis presents an alternative reading. He suggests Abraham actually had this profound faith, maybe even a kind of knowledge, that they would both return.
So it wasn't a blind test of faith.
Not entirely blind, perhaps. The idea here is that Isaac himself felt inspired to make the offering, and Abraham was, in a way, giving Isaac the chance to show that willingness to God.
That completely reframes it.
It does. And Louis uses this great analogy from music.
Oh, yeah?
He says, think about music where the melody goes up, right? Often the bass line beneath it moves down.
Okay, counterpoint.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it's that tension, that opposition, that creates the depth, the richness, the wisdom in the music.
So studying Torah is like listening for that bass line.
That's the idea. Look for the inverse counter melodies. The surface story is the melody, maybe, but the deeper truth, the bass line, might be moving in the opposite direction. He even links it to Kabbalah, this inverse reciprocal relationship between lights and vessels.
Like two opposing forces revealing a bigger picture when seen together.
You got it. It's about seeing the whole, not just the obvious part.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense now. So bringing this back to Absalom.
Right. Louis insists David's relationship with Absalom was quite different from what it may at first appear. It wasn't simple.
Not just the good king and the bad son.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And he basically promises the book will explore why David felt this way, why he understood something deeper than just Absalom's rebellion.
So it's setting up a major reinterpretation.
Absolutely. It invites you to question everything you thought you knew about that story.
Okay, so after setting up these ideas about interpretation, he shifts focus a bit, doesn't he, to the historical context?
Yeah, he zooms out to look at why Israel even wanted a king in the first place. He starts with God's fundamental hatred of slavery,
Moses leading them out of Egypt, giving them freedom, giving them the Torah.
which Louis calls the Constitution of Israel. But here's the twist, the paradox.
What's that?
Despite being freed, the Israelites complained constantly. They actually, incredibly, wished they could go back to Egypt, back to slavery.
Seriously, they resented Moses for freeing them.
According to Louis, yes. It says a lot about human nature, maybe. The fear of freedom, the desire for certainty, even oppressive certainty.
And this continued after Moses.
Well, Louis suggests that over the next, say, 350 years, that initial fire for liberty kind of dimmed. Governance became more committee-based, and people gradually forgot the bitter taste of slavery.
They forgot how bad it was.
Seems so. And instead, they developed what Louis calls a false sentimental nostalgia for the predictable life of a slave.
Wow, and they started looking at other nations.
Exactly. They saw kings, the palaces, the armies, the superficial trappings, as he puts it, and they got envious. They naively wanted to be slaves to a glorious king, thinking they'd somehow share in that glory.
It sounds quite naive, as he says, an empty desire.
Yeah, which sets the stage perfectly for Samuel.
Right, as Samuel comes in and tries to turn things around.
He does. Louis portrays him as the one who reawoke the divine inheritance of freedom from Moses. He rekindled that moral courage and ethical excellence from their ancestors.
And this wasn't just talk, right? It was a movement.
A revolutionary prophetic movement, Louis calls it. Sparked by Samuel, people found joy again. They started writing psalms, creating music, seeking God's guidance directly.
Aspiring to prophecy itself, like Moses wanted for everyone.
Exactly. And here's a fascinating point. Louis connects this ancient movement all the way to the present day for Jewish people.
Oh, so.
He says there's a hidden but very real link. And he singles out King David as having this unique role in bringing the world towards its supreme manifestation, a role that somehow still resonates.
Which explains the ongoing hope for the kingdom of David.
Yes, that call for renewal, Louis argues, is deep in the very soul of the Jew. You hear it in songs like King David is alive and well. You see it in the prayers, the psalms.
It's a living tradition, not just history.
That's the perspective. And then he brings it back again to the personal, his own father.
How his father chose to live freely by the Torah, resisting modern pressures.
Precisely. A concrete example of these principles in action. And he stresses again, it was that lesson about Absalom from his father that was the real catalyst for this book.
Written with his father's blessing to honor those deeper meanings in the David story.
Right. And he even notes where he's writing from Jerusalem, 2020, grounding it all.
Now, we should clarify what kind of book this actually is. He says it's not quite a standard commentary.
No, it's different. He describes it as a narrative that's interwoven into the text of Samuel.
Interwoven? How does that work?
Well, he draws on lots of sources, including, he says, imagination. But the key claim is that he's being absolutely faithful to the text. This interwoven story isn't fiction. It's presented as a kind of studied representation of possible solutions to the puzzles in the book of Samuel.
So he's filling in gaps, but based closely on the text itself.
That's the claim. He insists on the great accuracy and precision of how his narrative fits the Hebrew text. He argues that without this kind of interwoven understanding, the original text can seem confusing, contradictory.
Even seemingly counterproductive to virtues. I remember that phrase.
Yeah. He mentions relying on Hebrew grammar nuances, finding subtext that might be missed in translation.
Sounds complex.
He admits it is. He advises patience, saying the events and motivations in Samuel are layered, and the themes take time to come together.
Okay. What about the book of Samuel itself, its authorship and purpose?
He touches on the tradition. Samuel wrote the first part, up to his death, and then King David's own scribes finished it.
And their goal wasn't just history, right?
No, much more than that. Louis emphasizes their purpose was teaching deep, spiritual, noble principles and a courageous outlook on life.
So you, the reader, need to pay close attention. Look for clues.
Like searching for lost treasure, he says. Every detail might matter. And definitely read the whole book to get the full picture.
Makes sense. He also mentions the translation he uses.
Right, the JPS 1917 English version. But he adds bracketed alternatives sometimes, backed by Hebrew experts, if he feels a different meaning is important.
And those Masorah divisions, what are they about?
Ah, those are interesting. They're markings, like commas and periods within the Hebrew text, older than chapter divisions. Louis says they can enhance the narrative.
Oh.
Sometimes they appear mid-sentence, possibly signaling something significant happening beneath the surface, something unspoken. He says it might invite you to sense deep matters of God's thought, or even indicate a space where one of David's songs fits in.
Because David wrote his psalms alongside these life events.
Exactly. They were contemporaneous.
Okay. And before getting to the hymn, he lays out some core beliefs underpinning the book.
Yes, fundamental beliefs, like a strong belief in eternal life.
And in King David's holiness and righteousness.
Absolutely. Also, the idea that prophecy isn't just predicting the future, but it's a dialogue with God, potentially open to everyone.
That's a powerful thought.
It is. And then there's the concept of a spark of the Messiah's soul being present in every person.
Meaning anyone can strive to emulate King David.
That's the implication. And finally, the belief that there are purely righteous individuals, the Tzaddikim, who are like the foundation of the world.
Okay. So all that sets the stage for the hymn at the end of the introduction.
Right. A hymn of praise attributed to David himself. It's framed as gratitude to God for the gracious resurrection of his soldiers.
Resurrection. From who?
From the betrayal of what he calls the cursed triumvirate, people who violated his trust.
The hymn mentions specific numbers, doesn't it? 36 commandos.
Yes, 36 loyal soldiers brought down to dark death, but then gathered by God into deathless life.
Where is this deathless life?
It's described poetically as a place beyond ordinary life and death, the palace of the thoughts you thought before you created in your image true. Very mystical language.
And it connects back to Joab's betrayal, sending these men to their deaths.
Yes, but the interpretation here is that God allowed this as part of a plan to ultimately save Absalom. These deaths were an atonement somehow. 7 deaths to atone, it says, with the 36 coming before Absalom.
Wow. So Absalom is then seen. How?
As the beloved culmination of my sinless dynasty, waiting in a new celestial city while history unfolds. The hymn mentions plots against David, his children, and Absalom specifically.
And David's role in this?
There's that striking image again, David calling Absalom 7 times from death's ring.
Resurrecting him in a sense.
Into the protection of those resurrected, deathless warriors who will follow Absalom to redeem Israel eventually. David even says he'd have suffered more if he'd known how God would exalt his line.
It also mentions his enemies thinking they'd won.
Right, Joab, Achitophel, Jonadab. They made false accusations, thought they'd destroyed David's kingdom and killed Absalom for good, but they were wrong.
And David sees himself as a decoy.
Yes, willingly suffering so Absalom can bring salvation safely. And it ends simply, hallelujah.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into just the introduction, what are the big takeaways?
Well, several key things stand out, I think. First, this idea of layered meanings in the Bible. You really have to dig deeper than the surface.
And specifically, the surprising depth and nature of David's love for Absalom.
Definitely. Then there's the whole historical context, that complex relationship the Israelites had with freedom, why they even wanted a king.
And the spiritual significance of freedom running through it all?
Absolutely. It really hammers home that a superficial reading just won't cut it. You'll miss the richest insights, maybe even meanings that seem to contradict the obvious.
It's an invitation, then, isn't it, to engage with these texts differently?
Exactly. To look for that oblique subtext, those inverse counter melodies Louis talks about. It's a whole different way of reading.
So maybe a final thought for you, the learner, to chew on. Think about how often we might judge situations or people or even stories based just on first impressions.
Right. What if we actively look for those inverse relationships, those hidden motives or deeper currents, not just in ancient texts, but, in our own lives, in the world today? What truths might we uncover if we look past the obvious?
Something to consider. A challenge to perhaps see things with fresh eyes.